Ever get tricked by those optical illusions? You know, the ones where a stationary dot looks like it's moving? Makes you wonder how much of what we see is our brain kind of just making stuff up.
Yeah, it's a really interesting place to start because it gets at something so fundamental about how our brains work,
Hmm.
right? Like behind the scenes, they're always filling in gaps, building a complete picture out of all the sensory information that's coming
It's
in.
like a magician with a really, really good act.
Exactly.
Which brings us to Daniel Dennett.
Yes.
He's trying to demystify the magic of consciousness, but he's not appealing to, like, mysticism.
Mm.
He's trying to do it through science.
And he does it by starting in a really clever place.
Hmm.
He starts with hallucinations.
Oh, interesting. So instead of just dismissing them as like, oh, you're just seeing things, he thinks they actually give us clues about how our brains work.
Exactly. They're not just glitches in the system.
Mm.
They can actually tell us a lot about how our brains construct models of the world, even when those models don't line up perfectly with reality. It's like he uses that classic brain in a vat thought experiment. Have you heard of that one? Vaguely, yeah, like from my college philosophy days. It's been a while. Remind me.
Okay, so imagine you could never know for sure if you were actually just a brain in a vat being fed sensory information by some kind of like supercomputer.
Right.
Yeah, okay, I remember.
So Dennis' point is that even if you were just a brain in a vat, your brain would still be doing what brains do. It would be creating an experience based on the input that it receives.
So whether we're actually out in the world or just a brain in a vat, our brains are basically still building our reality.
Yes, exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. Dennett points out that when people have these really vivid hallucinations, they often describe themselves as being almost passive observers, like they're watching a movie.
Instead of feeling like they're in control of what they're seeing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like their brain is running on autopilot, just generating experiences based on these internal models, not so much on what's actually coming in from the outside world.
So is he saying that happens all the time, even when we're not having hallucinations?
To a degree, yes. I
Right.
mean, think about it. Our brains are constantly filling in the blanks, making predictions about what we're going to see or hear or feel based on what we've experienced before.
Yeah.
It's not like we're actually experiencing every single little detail of the world around us. Our brains highlight what's important and then kind of gloss over the rest.
So like those predictive text messaging apps that finish your sentences.
Yes, exactly. Our brain is like, okay, based on what you usually say, this is probably what's coming next.
It's creating like a best guess of what reality is.
Exactly.
And that leads into his whole multiple drafts model.
Rest. And this model really challenges that intuitive idea that we have of like a Cartesian theater in the brain.
You know that there's like a little screen and there's like the me inside watching it.
Exactly. That there's this one place where we experience things, then it's like, nope, not how it works.
Yeah.
Consciousness is not this single stream of experience. It's more like multiple parallel processes happening all at the same time.
So instead of like one director calling all the shots for the movie, it's like we have a whole team of editors all working on different drafts of the script at the same time.
Exactly. And those drafts, they're constantly being revised and updated and influenced by new information that's coming in all the time. There's no single moment or place where consciousness just like happens. It's much more dynamic than that.
So it's definitely more complex than just like seeing something in our minds. But how did we even get to this point? Like, did a single-celled organism just suddenly become self-aware?
Not quite. Dennett actually uses this concept of good tricks to explain how consciousness evolved.
Good tricks.
Yeah, so even really simple organisms, right?
Yeah.
Like they can develop these really advantageous behaviors through evolution. Things that help them survive, help them reproduce.
So even something like a tiny organism moving towards a source of light, that's a good trick.
Exactly. And over millions and millions of years, those good tricks, they become more and more complex. Those brains become more sophisticated, and eventually consciousness emerges.
So there's not like this giant leap forward. It's just like this gradual buildup of more and more complex tricks.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, too, that evolution, it's not working towards a goal. It's not like it was inevitable that we ended up with consciousness. It was just a really, really useful trick that emerged along the way.
Okay, so fast forward a few billion years and here we are. And Dennett seems to think that language is a pretty big deal when it comes to consciousness. Why is that?
Well, he believes that language isn't just for communicating with other people. It's also a way for us to shape our own thoughts.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, by using language, we can create symbols, we can categorize our experiences, we can construct these narratives about ourselves and the world around us. It's like language adds this whole other layer of processing power to our brains.
So it's not just about talking to other people, it's also about that voice that we have in our own head.
Yes, exactly. Dennett actually calls this auto-stimulation, and he believes that it was a total game changer for human consciousness. Like imagine our ancestors, talking themselves through a problem trying to make sense of their experiences. This internal dialogue could have helped them make new mental connections, which led to more sophisticated reasoning planning.
So we essentially like talked ourselves into being more conscious.
Kind of a wild thought, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Makes you wonder what our inner life would be like without language.
It really does. And this leads into another one of Dennett's ideas, right? The self as a center of narrative gravity.
Yes.
Okay, that sounds really intriguing, but I have no idea what that means.
So basically, it means that our sense of self isn't this fixed, unchanging thing. It's more like this ongoing narrative that we're constantly constructing and revising as we go through life.
Oh, okay.
So our memories, our beliefs, our values, all of these things contribute to this narrative.
Yeah.
And language is the tool that we use to kind of weave all of those elements together into a coherent story.
So it's like we're all authors of our own autobiography, constantly editing, revising as we go.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that a lot of this is happening unconsciously, right? It's not like we're consciously deciding what to include or how to tell the story.
Yeah.
It just kind of emerges from our experiences and our memories, and of course the language that we use to make sense of it all.
But if our brains are so busy constructing our reality and our sense of self, how do we know what's really real? I mean, this is where those split brain patients come in, right?
Yeah, they present a really fascinating challenge to our understanding of consciousness and the self.
For those of us who don't know, can you explain what a split brain patient even is?
So basically, it's someone who, for medical reasons, has had the connection between the two halves of their brain severed.
So are they like walking around with two separate minds?
Well, it's more complicated than that. In most cases, the two hemispheres continue to work together surprisingly well. But in certain situations, they can act independently. They can even give conflicting responses.
Oh, wow.
And this raises some really interesting questions about the whole idea of a unified self. Whether there's really a single I in charge, or if that's another one of our brain's clever constructions.
So even the idea of me as this unified thing, that could be another one of those good tricks that our brain is using.
It's a possibility that Dennett certainly explores. He suggests that the self might be more like a useful fiction that our brain creates, a way of organizing our experiences and our behavior, rather than some kind of fundamental indivisible entity.
Wow, that is a lot to process. It makes me wonder about how our brains create these complex inner worlds. We experience things like abstract thought. Does Dennett address that too?
Yeah, definitely. He points out that consciousness isn't just about, like, seeing pictures in our heads. It's also about language, abstract thought, all those incredibly different ways that we each experience the world.
So like how a musician experiences the world is going to be totally different from how a painter does?
Exactly. He actually uses the example of Vladimir Nabokov. The awesome.
Yeah, he wrote Lolita. Right.
Yeah, and he was also like a serious chess player.
Oh, that's right. He came up with all these famous chess problems too.
Yeah, so Dennett talks about how Nabokov's obsession with chess might have actually shaped his whole consciousness. Like he was experiencing the world through this lens of complex chess moves and strategies.
So instead of just seeing like a park bench, he's seeing a chessboard with all these potential moves and counter moves.
Exactly. And Dennett uses this example to illustrate this bigger point, that each of us has our own, like, heterophenomenological world. It's kind of a mouthful.
It really is.
But it basically means that our inner subjective experiences are incredibly unique.
Right.
They're shaped by our individual experiences and memories and ways of thinking.
So it's not like we're all watching the same movie in our heads.
Yeah.
We're each experiencing our own like personal director's cut.
Exactly. And that's what makes consciousness so fascinating. It's not this one-size-fits-all phenomenon. It's this incredibly diverse and constantly evolving tapestry of individual experience. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we should talk about, the so-called hard problem of consciousness.
Oh yeah, that's the one that keeps philosophers up at night.
That's the one. It's that question of, like, how do we explain the actual subjective qualitative feel of experience? Like, what is it actually like to see the color red or smell freshly cut grass or feel the warmth of the sun on your skin?
Yeah, those are really hard to put into words.
Exactly. And that's why some philosophers say that these subjective experiences, these qualia, are just beyond the reach of science. They think there's something ineffable, something fundamentally mysterious about them that we can't ever fully explain.
But Dennett disagrees.
He does. He thinks our intuitions about qualia are kind of misleading us. He argues that we tend to think about them as these separate, mysterious things because we haven't really grasped how our brains are actually constructing those experiences in the first place. He uses this thought experiment about a color scientist named Mary to kind of make his point.
Okay, yeah, I vaguely remember this from Intro to Philosophy. Remind me how it goes.
So imagine Mary has lived her whole life in a black and white room. She's never actually seen color,
Oh, wow. Okay.
but she's a brilliant scientist, and she knows everything there is to know about color. The physics,
Mhm.
the neurology, all of it.
So she knows the science of color, but she's never experienced it firsthand.
Right. So the question is, when Mary finally leaves that room and she sees color for the first time, does she learn something new?
Well, yeah, it seems like she would have to. Knowing about something and actually experiencing it are two different things.
Right. That's the intuition, and it's a really powerful one. But Dennett would say this intuition is based on a misunderstanding of what's going on in Mary's brain. He believes that once Mary sees color, her knowledge doesn't fundamentally change. It just becomes richer, more nuanced.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
Think about it this way. Before seeing color, Mary understood all the facts about what redness is, but she hadn't yet formed the neural connections, the reactive dispositions that allow her to experience redness in all its subjective glory.
So it's not that she gains access to like some mystical realm of qualia. It's more that her brain is now wired to interact with color in a whole new way.
Exactly. Her knowledge becomes more embodied, more integrated into her overall understanding of the world.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, Dennett is saying there's no ghost in the machine. There's no need to explain these magical, mysterious qualia.
Exactly. He's saying our subjective experiences, as rich and ineffable as they might feel, are ultimately grounded in the physical workings of our brains.
Wow, this is really making me think differently about how I experience the world. But I'm still a bit stuck on this whole filling in thing. Like, I know I have a blind spot in each eye, but I don't actually see a hole in my vision. It just seems complete.
Yeah, it's a common misconception that our brains are literally filling in those gaps with made-up information. Dennett's actually arguing against that. He's saying our brains are much more efficient than that.
So there's not like a little artist in my head frantically painting in the missing bits of my visual field.
Not quite. He believes that our brains are really good at representing information without needing to create this like pixel by pixel picture of the world.
Okay, so how does he explain that seamlessness then?
Think about it like a connect the dots puzzle. You don't need to see every single dot to recognize the picture.
Right.
Our brains are kind of similar. They can represent the gist, the essential information without needing to fill in every single detail.
So it's more about efficient representation than literal reconstruction.
Exactly. Our brains are masters of economy. They're only processing what's absolutely necessary for us to like navigate the world and make sense of our experiences.
Okay, that makes sense. But after diving into all of this, I have to ask, if consciousness is this constructed thing, this product of our brains and our experiences, what does that mean for our sense of free will, our personal identity, the meaning of life itself?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? And Dennett does not shy away from them.
It's kind of like a scary thought at first, realizing how much of what we think of as me might be more like constructed by our brains than like some kind of core unchangeable self.
Yeah, it's definitely a shift in perspective, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Uh,
In fact, Dennett would argue that understanding this constructed nature of consciousness can be really empowering.
Empowering how? I mean, if our brains are kind of calling the shots, how much agency do we really have?
Well, because if it's this dynamic process,
Right.
if it's constantly being shaped by our experiences and our interactions, then that means we actually have the power to influence how it develops. We can choose the stories we tell ourselves. We can cultivate new habits of mind. We can even expand those unique heterophenomenological worlds that we were talking about.
So it's not just this fixed, predetermined thing. There's room for growth, for change.
Exactly. It's not deterministic at all. He sees consciousness as this incredible feedback loop. We're not just passively receiving information, we're actively participating in the creation of our own reality.
Okay, that's a much more optimistic take than I was expecting. But where does this leave the whole idea of a soul? Like, if consciousness is a product of the brain, is there any room for something more?
That's a really big question. One that goes beyond what we can really get into here. Dennett is really focused on trying to explain consciousness through a scientific lens. He's not trying to make claims about, like, the existence or non-existence of a soul or anything like that.
Right, right. It's hard not to think about these big questions when you're digging into this stuff, though. What about the meaning of life, then? Like, if ourselves are essentially stories, does that make life meaningless?
I'd argue the opposite, actually.
Yeah.
It makes those stories even more meaningful. Think about it. If our sense of self, our values, our purpose, if all of that is something that we create, then it becomes even more precious. It's like realizing you're not just reading a pre-written script. You're the author of your own life.
Wow, yeah. That's a beautiful way to put it. This definitely leaves me with a lot to think about.
As it should. Dennett's work, it's not meant to give us all the answers.
Right.
It's more like a jumping off point. It encourages us to question our assumptions and to really delve deeper into the mysteries of our own minds.
And isn't that what the deep dive is all about? So for everyone listening out there, here's a final thought. If your consciousness is a story, what kind of story are you going to write with it?
What new chapters are you ready to explore? What can you even learn from the stories that other people are telling? You know those incredibly diverse narratives that make up the human experience? Keep those questions in mind as you continue your own deep dive into consciousness. You might be surprised by what you discover.
I love that. And thank you, Y, for joining us on this deep dive into Daniel Dennett's mind-bending theories. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.